What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So, Charles Oliveira is, of course, fighting Mateusz Gamrot this weekend, and I wanted to talk about Oliveira's career and do a bit of a retrospective and a celebration of him because there's a lot of discussion about whether or not he'll retire this weekend, win or lose. If he wins, there's discussion about whether he should pursue a title shot or not. And I think for a guy like Oliveira, who is such a beloved fan favorite fighter, who is a GOAT of the division, I think he deserves a retrospective because he has been fighting a long time. He has been fighting in the UFC for a very long time. And the turnaround for MMA fans is quite short. I think it's like 2 to 3 years. So a lot of the people who are going to watch him fight this weekend and a lot of the people who are going to watch a video like this haven't seen much of his career. Maybe they saw him, during his title reign or whatever. Maybe they only saw him after that. Maybe they've only seen him fight after losing to Islam. So for people like that, I think it's worth going through the past and sort of laying out what this guy did and why it was so awesome. Because he came to the UFC very young. I think he was like 10-0 or something. He was a young guy. He was either late teens or 20 years old. Kind of like Max Holloway that way. And the lion's share of his career is in the UFC. And some huge chunk of that was initially at featherweight. And what's interesting is that whole featherweight run, he just never seemed like he was going to turn into anything. He was always exciting. He was always reliable for a finish. He was always a jiu-jitsu ace. But he would pretty much without fail lose to really good fighters. His best win at featherweight is almost certainly Jeremy Stephens. But even that, it was before Stephens had kind of broken out as well. So he didn't even get that much credit at the time for the win. And other than that, his wins are against middling fighters. It's against people like Miles Jury and stuff like that. And anytime he fought someone who would actually be a contender or like a former champion or something like that, he would come up short. He would lose to Ricardo Lamas. He would lose to Frankie Edgar. He would lose to Cub Swanson, people like that. And I remember watching what I believe is his last fight at featherweight, which is the loss against Anthony Pettis, because Pettis at the time, he had lost his belt at lightweight. He had gone on to lose to other people like Alvarez and Barboza. And so he says, okay, I'm going to go down to featherweight. I'm a small lightweight. And he fights in his debut, Charles Oliveira. They have a back and forth scrambly jiu-jitsu match, and Pettis ultimately catches him in a guillotine and submits him. And of course, that's a bad look for Oliveira, who's supposed to be the jiu-jitsu wizard, and Pettis is nominally a striker, although he has very underrated jiu-jitsu himself. But then Pettis goes on to fight Holloway for the interim featherweight belt. Holloway is the up-and-coming contender. He's the coming man. We, of course, know that he goes on to be one of the GOATs in the division. He comfortably smashes Pettis, and Pettis goes back to lightweight. And so Oliveira is just seen as like a stepping stone in the story. He's just a stepping stone for Pettis to get to his interim title shot. He was even kind of a stepping stone for Holloway because Holloway fought him on his road to the title. Now, that match was kind of inconclusive because Oliveira ended up having some sort of weird esophagus issue and the fight got stopped within 30 seconds or something. But in any case, most people at the time just didn't think he would have anything for Holloway. But then what happens is Oliveira goes up to lightweight, and this is where things turn around. And his debut is very promising because he takes on a guy named Will Brooks, who most people won't remember, but at the time this was a cool win because Will Brooks was the Bellator champion. He had beaten Michael Chandler twice, TKOing him in one of those fights, and he had come to the UFC. He had lost a fight against Cowboy Oliveira, not Charles Oliveira, but Cowboy Oliveira. But that fight was kind of weird because Oliveira had missed weight by 5 pounds. He's a guy who should have just always been at welterweight. He's a habitual weight misser. And that fight was back and forth, and then he's having a hard time dealing with the size and the grappling of Cowboy Oliveira, and he eventually gets TKO'd. So it's not a good look, but you can kind of excuse it on Brooks's part. But then he goes on to fight Charles Oliveira in his lightweight debut, and this is where you really see things start to come together for Charles because he was always a scrappy grappler and an all-around exciting fighter. But this is one of the first times you really see his wrestling come into play and his strength in the clinch come into play. This is where you start really, for the first time, seeing him just ragdoll people. And that's what he does to Brooks. And he clinches him, whips him around, he gets on his back, chokes him out, takes hardly any time at all, happens within a round. And so at the time, you're like, okay, this is looking good. Maybe this is going to be a turnaround for Oliveira. However, he goes on to fight Paul Felder, and what happens? He's doing good at first, but then Felder guts it out, gets on top of him. He's in his guard, he's landing elbows, he's landing punches, and he TKOs him. He TKOs Charles on the ground. And this is one of the fights that led to Oliveira having a reputation for being a bit of a quitter. And it's sort of like Dustin Poirier, because Poirier, to a lesser degree, but Poirier also had a bit of that reputation earlier in his career that he has since completely erased. And so is Oliveira. It's sort of like an inverse of Anthony Smith, where Smith, with his self-branding of Lionheart and with him having a million fights and some good scraps and everything, had this reputation of being a bit of a blood and guts fighter. But of course, as time went on and we saw him more and more quit in fights, more and more accept bottom position, accept like seated guard position and bottom of turtle and stuff like that, and just not try to win. Like now he has the opposite reputation. But anyways, Oliveira, it's a bit of a low point for him, the Felder loss. But this is where, the greatness begins, because this is now the start of his win streak and the start of his run towards the title and his title defenses. And I was there for the first fight in that streak, because I was there in Chicago for UFC 225, which was Whitaker versus Romero 2. And on the prelims, Oliveira fought Clay Guida and submitted him in the first round. And that whole card is exceptional. It's one of the best UFC events in history, I think. But I remember seeing that live and being like, okay, he's back on track. This is a good look. Guida is not the best win in the world, but I'm interested. I still want to see more Oliveira. And then he started putting together wins against, middling opponents, people like Nick Lentz and stuff like that. But he was getting this reputation for violence, because this is also when his striking started coming together. And this is a term I believe I'm borrowing from the Heavy Hands podcast, but they use the phrase or the term Swiss Army knife of violence to describe certain fighters. And they gave that label to Oliveira. They gave it to like Tony Ferguson. They gave it to Cheeto Vera, people like that, where they're just constantly violent, and they're violent everywhere, and they're finishing threats everywhere. So they can TKO you, they can submit you with an array of submissions. They can hurt you with their fists, with their elbows, with their knees, with their feet. Like they're just, again, Swiss Army knives of violence. And that's a great label, and that is one of my favorite kind of archetypes of fighters. And it's like a label I wouldn't even give to someone like Jiri Prochazka, even though he's probably the best action fighter in the UFC right now. I still wouldn't even call him that, because he's overwhelmingly a knockout guy. He's got a submission here or there. He, of course, submitted Glover Teixeira, but he's overwhelmingly a knockout guy. You don't generally have to worry about him taking it to the ground and doing a million submission holds on you. If you want to see probably the greatest example in the history of MMA of like the Swiss Army knife of violence, it's Mamed Khalidov. Okay, and most people haven't heard of him because he never came to the UFC. He was in KSW forever, and he was the KSW champion. I believe he was a multi-divisional KSW champion. But that guy is one of the most exciting fighters in the history of the sport, period. And a million different kinds of submissions, a million different kinds of knockouts. Like, go look him up. Like, if you want exciting fights, Mamed Khalidov is the fucking guy, okay? Anyways, Charles Oliveira goes on the streak, and then he has this first major step up in competition against Kevin Lee. And this is kind of a breakout performance for him because, again, this is where the striking is really coming together, the pressure is really coming together, the volume, the precision is coming together. He just beats the shit out of Kevin Lee and then submits him. Great win. Fights Tony Ferguson. And at the time, this was like still a pretty good win because this is Tony Ferguson's first fight coming off of the Gaethje loss, so people didn't realize it was the second fight in this seemingly endless losing streak. And a lot of people were picking Tony to win. I remember at the time kind of discussing with a friend of mine, who was going to win, and I was like, oh no, man, I get the vibe that Charles is just going to ragdoll him and submit him. And that very nearly happened. The armbar was incredibly close. The triangle choke was good. In some ways, it seemed like a mercy almost on Oliveira's part to not finish him. But he did ragdoll him, and he did show that his grappling was just leagues ahead of Tony's. And so that's a very good win. Even in hindsight, that's still a very good win. It's not peak Tony. It's not like it's Tony coming off of the RDA win, but it's a very good win regardless. And so then he fights Chandler for the vacant belt. And this is also a very good win and a very good opponent. And people underrate Chandler because they know that he's lost the majority of his UFC fights and is approach to fighting has just gotten dumber and more like action focused over the years. But at the time, this was a very good win. And Chandler showed in that fight why he was a difficult matchup. Because Chandler is not just a wrestler. He is a good grappler. Now, he might not show it lately, might not show it against Paddy Pimblett, but in his prime, he was a very good grappler. And he fought, like he has very good submission wins. He submitted Eddie Alvarez, Rick Hahn, Marcin Held. He's fought good grapplers and like stayed off their submission attempts like Brett Primus and Yamauchi. Like he is a good grappler. And I was kind of thinking he might be a poisonous matchup for Oliveira because I was like, yeah, I don't think he's going to get submitted. I think he might just knock his ass out. And that almost happened because in the fight, it's scrappy, they're scrambling. Charles ends up on top. He gets his back. What happens? Chandler defends the choke. He escapes the body lock, gets on top, starts raining down ground and pound. They get to the feet. He drops Oliveira. It's looking like it might go to a finish. Round ends. Round 2 starts. Oliveira almost instantly knocks him out with one of the most picture-perfect left hooks you'll ever see. And that's all she wrote. But Chandler showed that he was legit in that fight. And I've talked about this in previous videos, but Chandler, he gets overly hated because of his losing streak in the UFC, but he is well past his best days. He's like 38 years old now or something. And he was past his prime when he came to the UFC. Like if you were following his career in Bellator, then you probably had the feeling when it got announced that he was coming to the UFC of like, oh, that's cool. I'm glad to see that. But it's a shame he didn't do it a few years earlier because he's no longer at his best, And so that means even in the Hooker fight and in the first Oliveira fight, he was already past his prime. Still a good fighter, but past his prime. And what he is now, as we've seen against Paddy Pimblett, it's a shell of that. So that's just what happens when you age. But anyways, Oliveira beats Chandler, becomes the champion. But at the time, a lot of people were not giving him full credit because Dustin Poirier was around. And Poirier was kind of seen as the second best guy, a distant second, but the second best guy behind Khabib. And Khabib himself kind of pushed that narrative a bit. And Poirier was coming off, I believe, 2 wins when he fought Oliveira, because I believe it was Dan Hooker and McGregor. It must have been both McGregor fights. So it was like a 3-fight win streak, I believe, going into the Oliveira fight. And a lot of people saw him as the guy who should have fought Oliveira for the vacant belt. They thought it was kind of bullshit that Chandler, kind of leapt the queue with that Hooker win. And would Poirier have won? Would Poirier have beaten Charles? A lot of people would have just seen Charles as like a pretender to the throne, as a guy who was a paper champion, but never was really the best guy and just shouldn't have been there in the first place. He just should have lost to Poirier initially and never been the champion. Thankfully, for me as a Oliveira fan, he beats Poirier, submits him, and he goes on to beat Gaethje, another guy who people were picking to beat him, another guy who people were seeing, kind of like how I saw Chandler, as like, okay, this guy might defend the takedowns, he's athletic, he's explosive, he's a hard hitter, Oliveira's dangerous, but he's very hittable, he gets dropped all the time, like this guy's going to put him out. For most of those fights, for the Chandler fight, the Poirier fight, and the Gaethje fight, a lot of people, the people who were picking against Oliveira were basically picking the outcome that came about in the Ilya fight. Like, okay, this guy's a good enough grappler that Charles won't submit him or won't get him down long enough or what have you, and he's going to knock his fucking ass out. And that only actually happened in the Ilya fight, because that did not happen in the Islam or the Arman fight. Now, Islam did hurt him and drop him, but he ultimately submitted him, and the Arman fight was just grappling from Arman. But in any case, that leads us to the Islam loss, which I have argued was a past prime Oliveira. He was like 33, I believe, in that fight. And he'd had over 40 fights. He'd been fighting for well over 10 years. He'd been knocked out 4 times and dropped in countless other fights. He trains at Shoot a Box. This is a guy with a shitload of wear and tear and damage. This is just not a guy at his peak, which doesn't mean it's an illegitimate win for Islam. Doesn't mean it's not a great win. Doesn't mean Oliveira wasn't still, maybe the second or third best fighter in the division at the time. But it's still post-prime. Doesn't mean he was washed. Doesn't mean he was dog shit. It's kind of like his win over Ferguson, except he was even, at a better place in his career than Ferguson was at the time. But it's not peak Oliveira that lost to Islam. Then he rebounds very nicely against Dariush, loses a nip-tuck decision against Arman. beats Chandler, but, it's way more competitive than it should have been, or at the end anyways, and he doesn't get the finish. And then he, of course, goes on to get knocked out by Ilya, which brings us to today. So, he's fighting Gamrot. Now, thankfully, this is kind of a safe matchup where you're not too worried that Gamrot's going to knock him out or submit him. You think if he loses to Gamrot, it will be by decision, most likely. And there's a real shot that he hurts Gamrot and can submit him. So I'm not even sure who I'm picking, and this is not really a prediction video, but I'm comfortable with Oliveira's chances. Now, the real question, though, is should he retire, win or lose? Because I tend to want fighters to retire early, especially champions. Like when a champion is clearly past their best, I usually just want them to leave. When a champion loses the belt and then goes on to immediately lose to like one of the top contenders or something like that, I usually just want them to retire because I just don't need to see them take more and more and more damage, more and more losses, put like a worse and worse taste in our mouths as far as the last thing we remember them for. I don't like the Tony Ferguson situation. I don't like the BJ Penn situation where you remember them more for the streak of losses than you do for the streak of wins. I just don't like that shit. And so I would have been totally fine if Oliveira just retired after losing to Arman, and certainly would have been fine if he retired after losing to Ilya. Now with Gamrot, if he loses, like I definitely just want to see him retire because if he loses to Gamrot, I just am not interested then in seeing like, yeah, well now he's going to fight Gaethje in a rematch or something like that. Or now he's going to fight Fiziev. Like I just don't need to see that shit anymore. I don't need to see him take more and more damage for kind of no reason. Which doesn't mean he couldn't still have an exciting like Poirier-esque like send-off fight, even in a loss. Maybe he fights one of those guys. Maybe he fights Max again and loses, but it's a war and it goes the distance or whatever. But like, and that's a feel-good thing in its own way. But broadly speaking, I like want these guys to retire early. I just do. I don't like seeing them take life-altering fucking damage when there's no gain to be had for it. But what happens if he beats Gamrot? Now it's a trickier situation because I'd also love to see him retire off a win. Like he clearly took this quick rebound because it's not too long ago that he got knocked out by Ilya. He clearly took this quick rebound because he wants to fight in Brazil. And so if he can win in Brazil and if he can get a finish, that's like a perfect ride off into the sunset sort of victory. That's like a Robbie Lawler finish to a career, which very few fighters get. And it would be one of his best wins, frankly. You can debate where Gamrot would rank in his wins. It's better than Kevin Lee. It's arguably better than the first Chandler win. Like, it's arguably better than the Gaethje win. Like, it's kind of dicey. So you could you could kind of go in a range, but it's certainly a top 5 win of his career if he beats Gamrot. So, like, worst case, it's number 5. Like, worst case, it's, like, behind Dariush. It's behind the first Chandler fight. It's behind Poirier and Gaethje, but that still puts it at number 5. And to do it at such a late stage makes it all the more impressive because it's not quite on the level of Kamaru Usman coming back at his age and beating Buckley, but it's approaching that territory a little bit. And so that would be a fine way to end. However, if he wins, and especially if he wins, like, spectacularly, he might have a path to the title. I don't think he'll ever beat Ilya, but Ilya might not be around because Ilya seems like a guy who's going to retire early. I could easily see him defending the belt once or twice and then going up to welterweight to fight Islam or whoever's up there and then just leaving. And so there's a chance that Oliveira wins and he says, okay, well now I'm like one fight away from a title shot. And by the time I get that title shot, Ilya might just be gone. So why not stick around? Like, why not? I beat Gamrot, and then, I get my rematch against Holloway. Maybe I beat him. Boom, title shot. And maybe that title shot is for a vacant belt, and maybe it's against someone like Patty, which is a winnable fight. And all of a sudden, Oliveira's legacy and his GOAT status getting quite elevated if he can pull that off. So I'm of two minds about it. Like, I'll be very happy if he can just win and retire, but I get it. There is a path. There is a path forward because of the kind of landscape of the division that's making me think about this a little differently than I typically would. Because typically in this situation, I would just overwhelmingly say, dude, just retire. Just retire. title shot's not realistic. You don't need the damage. You're not going to get a better fucking moment than this to retire. Everyone loves you. Just fucking retire. Just let it go. But in this case, again, with those details, I'd be okay watching him continue. So I'm definitely rooting for him. And I like Gamrot. I like Gamrot more than most people do. But holy shit, am I rooting for Oliveira to just wash him and just finish him within a few rounds and just comfortably outstrike him, comfortably deal with, have some cool scrambly grappling exchanges where Oliveira, scares him off or gets on top, reverses him, whatever, and then guillotines him or something. That's what I want to see. And if I see that, I'll be okay if he wants to stick around, but we'll see what happens. In any case, I just wanted to throw this out there because Oliveira is one of the best fighters of all time, both in terms of, he's somewhere, in a GOAT list, maybe top 25, something like that. But he's also one of the best lightweights of all time. And he's one of the most beloved fan favorite fighters of all time. And he's one of him and Davis and Figueiredo are pretty much the only two fighters who are at once divisional GOATs. Not the top GOATs, but they're somewhere in the GOAT list of their division. They're somewhere in the overall GOAT list. And they're amongst the most exciting, dangerous action fighters of all time. Because Figueiredo, another Swiss Army knife of violence sort of archetype. These sorts of guys, to be that kind of action fighter and that level of quality, that level of champion, again, extremely rare to the point that they're the only fucking two I can think of. So, fingers crossed that we get to see Oliveira pull it off again this weekend.